The eviction moratorium has taught landlords some important lessons. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over important lessons that landlords have learned since the eviction moratorium. Okay, so there's a lot of things to really dive into in this topic. It really goes to show you that there's always something new for landlords to learn, and the landlords who had their bases covered from the get-go, they're the ones who turned out the best. They were the ones who were able to make it through all of this. Okay, but before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know lessons that you learned during this coronavirus pandemic. Okay, let me know, exactly things that you've changed about the way you run your landlord business, and things that you're going to be doing in the future that will help mitigate the risk in case something like this happens again. So this article that comes from jdsupra.com, and it says 6 COVID-19 lessons for landlords. Let's see what it says. COVID-19 created a perfect storm for landlords, many of whom were thrown curveball after curveball, requiring them to adjust on the fly for their renters. The most challenging part for a landlord during the pandemic has not been the inability to collect rent, but the ongoing duty to maintain the property and to control emotions brought on by the pandemic. Landlords' obligations were not put on hold during the pandemic, but COVID made it more difficult to fulfill them. Even if tenants are unable to or refuse to pay rent, landlords are still required to manage tenant disputes, assure tenants ordinary safety and extraordinary safety when and if a tenant contracted the COVID, and maintain the property when many building maintenance services were closed or limited. Yeah, so they put the eviction moratorium into place. They said, hey, guess what, landlords? You still have to pay all of your bills, but the tenant doesn't have to pay any of theirs. And while, the issue of fairness comes up, right? And then the issue of, the Constitution comes up, they never actually thought about that when they put these eviction moratoriums into place. So they created these rental assistance programs, to help the landlords out. But then they put no method into place for the rental assistance to get to landlords in any sort of an efficient manner. So obviously, that created a huge problem for landlords who just saw tons of money going out and a lot less money coming in. Landlords are not relieved of their duties until the landlord-tenant relationship ends, either by agreement with the tenant or by order of the court. For landlords who ignored their duties during COVID, their inaction could have serious legal implications, including the ability to recover costs and a profit. We do not know when another disaster will appear, but landlords can learn important basic lessons from the COVID crisis. And now they're going to go into some of these lessons, and I learned some of these on my own, obviously through experience from before the pandemic. But other smaller landlords who maybe aren't as experienced, maybe they are just getting these lessons now, and let's go over them. Number 1, the importance of cash reserves. During this pandemic, property owners paying federally backed mortgages were allowed to forbear their required payments. That may not be the case next time. Even without the forbearance, landlords must understand that the mortgage is not their only expense. They are required to maintain the leasehold in a habitable condition, including but not limited to maintaining a clean building free from pests with properly functioning plumbing, heating, and electricity. Now, they go over mortgage forbearance there for landlords. Most landlords during this pandemic did not get forbearance. I did hear a few, comments down in my videos from a few landlords who were able to get forbearance, and I'm glad that they were able to do that. But the majority of the landlords who are suffering through this, they either weren't eligible for forbearance or they never applied for it. And there's a lot of stipulations and rules on forbearance and reasons why landlords wouldn't want to go for it. But on to the topic of having enough emergency reserves. I always try to have at least enough emergency reserves to cover all of my mortgage payments and all of my personal expenses on top of that for 6 months. Okay. And I know that that's a lot of money to have just sitting around, but I do have that money there just in case. Now, the other thing is, because I own more than just, one or two properties, I do have usually enough cash flow coming from the other properties to cover the expenses if I have one or two tenants who aren't paying. So that might be a motivation for some of you to, hey, we got to get more properties, because just having one or two rentals isn't enough to keep this ball rolling in case something stops happening. But I also have heard bad experiences in some of the videos I've covered where you've had a landlord who has 10 units and 8 of them aren't paying. What do you do in that kind of situation? You got to have emergency reserves. Number 2, screen your tenants. Preventing litigation is better than litigating. So although it seems easier to choose tenants who agree to pay a higher price, can pay immediately, will move in quickly, and claim to hold a steady job, it is vital to conduct a thorough background check to review their credit history. It can help you in understanding the tenant better. Some tenants are financially solvent but have poor money management skills. A high credit score generally indicates a person who cares about their credit. They may have a habit of paying their debts on time and in full. They may be less likely to believe the misconception surrounding COVID-19 that they are excused from paying rent with or without a reason to do so. Yeah, and I always do a thorough job of screening tenants. Okay, so I use TransUnion Smart Move, and they do credit check and background check on these tenants. And I suggest that all landlords, for every single tenant that you put into one of your properties, you do the same. I mean, you do some kind of tenant screening. I will call up their employers. I'll ask for paycheck stubs, and in some cases I've asked for bank statements to help prove their income coming in. And you have to do what you have to do, because the last thing you want is a tenant who can't pay rent up in your unit, and then you have to go through an eviction process or face months on end of non-paying tenants. So the better you screen your tenants, the less likely you were to have suffered consequences going through the eviction moratorium. Now, that's not always the case, but in some cases you do have these tenants who screened very well and they still ended up losing their jobs, and you still were out money. But it helps mitigate that risk. And we're going to make it even harder going into the future for these questionable tenants to get into our properties because of the eviction moratorium. Number 3, communicating with tenants. Tenants are human and they interact with one another. During a high-stress event, including the pandemic, conflict between tenants may be heightened. A landlord has a duty to keep the property safe and habitable. It is important to have a pulse on the situation, be diligent and thorough when faced with an issue, and to be fair with all tenants. The best way to manage and minimize problems is to keep open communications with all tenants. As a bonus, open communications helps you maintain the property and resolve minor issues before they become major. So when the pandemic went down, the original eviction moratorium went in place, your business got shut down back last year in March of 2020. I personally called all of my tenants and told them, hey, listen, I know that you might be going through financial trouble right now. I ask that, if you do need help, just let me know, and I will do whatever I can to work with you so that we can get through this. And I did that with all the tenants in the properties that I personally manage. And fortunately, I didn't miss a single rent payment, but they all were very understanding, and communication works. That's what I'm trying to say. Communication does work. Number 4, maintaining properties. A landlord has a duty to keep their rental habitable and in some instances to repair and replace damaged items. A well-maintained property keeps both the landlord and the tenant safe. During the pandemic, it was difficult for landlords to enter their property, especially when people were told to isolate and remain at home. However, landlords still were required to obtain the necessary materials and find service providers to make the repairs. Planning and tending to the property needs on an ongoing basis will benefit the landlord and the tenant in the future. Yeah, you got to keep those properties up, okay? You got to keep them up even if the tenant isn't paying rent, because the last thing you want is not only did the tenant not pay rent for the last 6, 12 or 18 months. But then when you finally are able to get back into the property, you've got tens of thousands of dollars worth of repairs that need to be made before you can get another tenant in there. Number 5, the pain of an eviction. The cost of evictions varies a lot, but it could be for landlords an expensive process as well. Among the costs for landlords as well is the emotional cost of an eviction. Matthew Desmond. It is no secret that evictions are expensive. In normal times, evictions take months to complete. The pandemic only lengthened the time for evictions to conclude. Even when an eviction has concluded and the court has granted possession of the property and holdover rent, a legal judgment may need to be enforced. Landlords can ask the local sheriff to remove former tenants and commence their collection efforts through a garnishment or levy. Landlords, however, cannot physically remove the tenant from the premises. Yeah, and I've gone through evictions before in some of my properties, and they're not fun and they are not cheap. You know, when all was said and done, when you included, loss of rental income, the cost of me hiring a lawyer and everything else, I think I was down $3,500 to $4,000 removing one tenant. Okay. So it was awful. And that was before the pandemic. Okay. So imagine not getting paid rent for a year and a half on top of that. So eviction is awful. Nobody wants to go through an eviction. I much rather would the tenant just come up to me and say, hey, listen, I can't pay rent. I'm not going to be able to pay rent. I'm just going to move on my own. Please don't file eviction on me. I'll just leave. I would much rather that happen than have to go through another one of those evictions. But, it's part of the business. You have to plan for it to happen eventually, and it will happen to a lot of you out there. Number 6, seek good legal advice. Courts were closed during the pandemic, and when they reopened, many landlords were unable to evict tenants for non-payment of rent. While landlords were able to evict tenants during the pandemic, courts could not hear cases predicated on non-payment of rent. Some landlords sought eviction based on a breach of contract claim. Unfortunately, contract claims are not as straightforward and easy to prove as non-payment of rent. The pandemic was and is a challenging time for landlords and their tenants. Landlords should remember that they provide the necessity of a home to tenants and a duty to maintain that property. They invested in real estate because it seemed like a less risky business than other investment opportunities. But no business is without risk. The tips outlined above will hopefully help landlords understand their duties, minimize their risks, and keep their investments profitable. Communicating with and keeping good tenants will help the community and the landlord survive difficult times. And yeah, that last paragraph is very true. Okay, so landlords out there, just keep doing what you're doing. But, my suggestion is always, if you're going to go through the eviction process, hire a lawyer. I know that they're expensive. I know it's not necessarily difficult for some landlords to go and do evictions where they live, but I like to hire a lawyer to do that for me so that all my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted. So I learned a lot of these lessons before the pandemic. Obviously I've been doing this for a while, and I have 12. I had 16 rental units for a while. I have 12 right now, and a lot of landlords who learn these tough lessons during the pandemic, I hope that they're able to keep going in the business, and that they don't give up on real estate investing, and they keep doing it, because in the long run this is still a very good means of getting to retirement.